Imagine a god who was born in the morning and before the day's end had already stolen an entire herd of cattle from his own brother. Imagine a divine being who was the patron of merchants, but simultaneously the protector of thieves and con artists. Imagine the messenger of the gods, the one who carried messages between heaven and earth, but whose first words were a lie. This god was Hermes, one of the most fascinating and contradictory figures in Greek mythology. How is it possible that a being who embodied deception, cunning, and theft became one of the most revered gods of ancient Greece? Why was he entrusted with the most important messages when everyone knew he was a master at manipulating truth? And what does his story reveal about our own nature, about the boundaries between wisdom and cunning, between intelligence and deception? The answers to these questions will take us further than we might expect. Hermes is not just an ancient character from distant myths. He is an archetype living within each of us, and his story can help us understand those parts of our soul that we often hide from the world and from ourselves. Hermes was born in a cave on Mount Selene as the son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, one of the Pleiades. His mother lived in seclusion, far from the eyes of Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, and their son was born in secrecy. But from the very first hours of his life, Hermes showed that he would not be an ordinary child. According to legend, Hermes escaped from his cradle just a few hours after birth. This in itself was remarkable, but what followed was even more extraordinary. The newborn god found a tortoise, immediately recognized the potential in its shell, and created the first lyre, the stringed instrument that became the symbol of Greek music and poetry. Carl Kerényi, the eminent scholar of Greek mythology, writes about this. The birth of Hermes is a story of instantaneous transformation. Already as an infant, he possessed the ability to see what others cannot see, to recognize hidden possibilities in ordinary things. This quality, the ability to see beyond the apparent, accompanied him throughout his entire life. But Hermes did not stop at creating the lyre. That very same night, he set out on a journey and stole Apollo's herd of cattle. And the way he did it demonstrates his brilliant cunning. Hermes drove the cattle backwards so that the footprints led in the wrong direction, and he fashioned special sandals for himself that concealed his own tracks. When Apollo finally discovered him and confronted him, the newborn god feigned innocence with perfect sincerity. "How could I have stolen your cattle?" he asked. "I was only born yesterday." This scene perfectly illustrates Hermes's nature. He was capable of lying so convincingly that it seemed almost credible, even when the lie was completely obvious. Walter F. Otto, expert on Greek religion, observes about this. Hermes's lies were not simple deceptions. He recognized that the boundary between truth and falsehood is much more blurred than we think. Reality always depends on perspective, and Hermes was a master at shifting perspectives. Zeus eventually had to intervene in the conflict between Apollo and Hermes. Instead of punishing the young god for theft and lying, however, he was fascinated by Hermes's inventiveness and creativity. Hermes then pulled out the lyre he had built and began to play it. The music was so beautiful that Apollo immediately offered to exchange the entire herd for this instrument. This exchange has deep symbolic significance. Hermes gave the lyre, the instrument of art and inspiration, in exchange for material wealth. But he did not stop there. He also created the pan flute, and when Apollo wanted to obtain that as well, Hermes received in exchange Apollo's golden staff, which later became the famous caduceus, Hermes's staff entwined with two serpents. Jane Ellen Harrison, scholar of Greek religion and mythology, writes, "This exchange between Apollo and Hermes was not merely a transaction, but the meeting of two different life philosophies. Apollo was the god of order, harmony, and light. Hermes was the god of movement, change, and boundary crossing. When they exchanged gifts, both were enriched by something that had been missing from them. Zeus was so impressed by Hermes's capabilities that he appointed him messenger of the gods. From that moment on, Hermes was the one who transmitted messages between the gods and humans, who carried them from one world to another." But this role had a much deeper significance than a simple delivery service. Hermes became the figure capable of crossing boundaries. He crossed the boundary between gods and mortals. He crossed the boundary between the living and the dead when he accompanied souls to the underworld. He crossed geographical boundaries as patron of merchants and travelers. And perhaps most importantly, he also crossed the boundary between truth and falsehood. Norman O. Brown, philosopher and scholar of mythology, observes about this. "The essence of Hermes lies in boundary crossing. He is the intermediary who shows us that the world does not operate in black and white categories. The boundaries we consider fixed are actually permeable, and Hermes is the one who teaches us how to navigate in these in-between spaces." One of Hermes's most important roles was to be psychopomp, guide of souls. When someone died, Hermes was the one who accompanied the soul to the underworld, to the realm of Hades. This role was extremely important because it ensured that the souls of the dead found their way and did not wander aimlessly in the world. But this role too was full of contradictions. Hermes, known for his lies, now had the task of honestly and justly guiding souls to their final rest. Why did the gods and humans trust him at this critical moment? The answer perhaps lies in the fact that Hermes understood the nature of transition. Death is not a simple end, but a transition from one state to another. And transitions are always ambiguous, always uncertain. Hermes, who was himself Lord of Boundaries, perfectly understood this ambiguity. His role in commerce also reveals interesting contradictions. Hermes was the god of merchants, travelers, and roads, but at the same time, he was the patron of thieves. How is this contradiction possible? The answer lies in the fact that the ancient Greeks recognized that between commerce and theft, there is a very thin boundary. Both concern the movement of values. Both are based on recognizing opportunities and acting quickly. The only difference lies in social acceptability. Marcel Détienne, French historian and anthropologist, writes, "Hermes embodies the awareness that moral categories are not absolute. The Greeks knew perfectly well that a clever merchant and a skilled thief use the same capabilities. The only difference is in context and acceptance of social rules." Another important quality of Hermes was Metis, cunning intelligence. This did not mean merely intelligence, but the ability to adapt quickly, to recognize opportunities, and to find solutions even in situations that others would consider hopeless. Metis is the type of intelligence that is not about following rules, but about creatively circumventing them. It is the intelligence that does not accept boundaries as they appear to be, but always seeks the loophole, the solution, the way through. Jean-Pierre Vernant, scholar of Greek thought, observes, "Metis was Hermes's most important quality. It is not morally neutral because it can be used for good or for evil, but this intelligence is indispensable in those situations where traditional approaches do not work." Hermes's role in the underworld is particularly interesting from the perspective of reincarnation. If Hermes accompanied souls to the underworld, what happened afterwards? Although in Greek mythology there was no developed teaching on reincarnation, in the Orphic mysteries and later among the Pythagoreans, this idea had already appeared. According to some interpretations, Hermes not only led souls to the underworld, but also brought them back from there when they needed to be reborn. This role would have been the logical continuation of his function as intermediary, since he was the only one capable of crossing boundaries in both directions. Peter Kingsley, scholar of ancient philosophy and religion, writes, Hermes's role in the transmigration of souls may have been central in those teachings that remained hidden from public mythology. He was the only god who could move freely between all worlds, so it was natural that he would help souls in rebirth as well. If this story of Hermes interests you, and you want to dive even deeper into the mysteries of ancient wisdom, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. In upcoming videos, we will reveal many more similar secrets that can illuminate your spiritual path in a new way. The Hermetic tradition, which bears the name of Hermes Trismegistus, that is, thrice great Hermes, later gave him an even deeper spiritual significance. This tradition merged the Greek Hermes with the Egyptian Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic. The Hermetic writings, particularly the Corpus Hermeticum, contain teachings that became the foundation of Gnostic and alchemical traditions. These texts taught that man carries within himself the divine spark, and that with appropriate knowledge and practice, he can attain divinity. Francis A. Yates, scholar of Renaissance Hermeticism, writes, The Hermetic tradition presented Hermes not only as a cunning trickster, but also as the bearer of the highest wisdom. This transformation shows that the same figure was capable of embodying both human cunning and divine knowledge. One of the central elements of Hermetic teachings was the famous Emerald Tablet, which was said to be the work of Hermes Trismegistus. The most famous sentence of the tablet reads, "That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracle of the one thing." This sentence concisely summarizes the Hermetic worldview. Everything is connected to everything. The macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm and vice versa. And Hermes, who could cross all boundaries, perfectly understood this connection. In the alchemical tradition, Hermes played a crucial role. Alchemists considered Hermes Trismegistus their master and sought to understand and apply the wisdom he had transmitted. Alchemy was not simply about transforming lead into gold, but about the transformation of the soul. Carl Gustav Jung deeply studied alchemical symbols and recognized in them the process of psychological transformation. Hermes's figure in this context represented Mercury, the quicksilver, which is fluid, changeable, elusive, but indispensable for transformation. Jung writes, Mercury in alchemy is Hermes's legacy. It is the paradoxical element that is simultaneously poisonous and healing, elusive and indispensable. During the transformation of the soul, we must pass through this Mercury phase, where everything becomes uncertain, where old boundaries dissolve, before the new form can be born. The connection between Hermes and language is also extremely important. Hermes was the one who brought language to humans, who taught them communication. But this language that Hermes gave was always ambiguous. With it, one could always lie or tell the truth. This awareness raises profound philosophical questions. If language itself is Hermes's gift, and Hermes was the master of lies, how much can we trust what we say or hear? Is not all communication, at some level, manipulation? Norman Malcolm, philosopher, observes about this. The hermetic nature of language means that every statement simultaneously reveals and conceals the truth. When we speak, We always choose what to say and what not to say, how to formulate things. This choice always carries within it the possibility of manipulation. The protection of boundaries was also Hermes's task. In ancient Greece, the Herma, a quadrangular pillar with Hermes's head and phallus, marked boundaries, roads, property limits. These Hermes simultaneously protected and marked boundaries. But why would Hermes, who was himself the god of boundary crossing, be the guardian of boundaries? This contradiction again shows Hermes's complex nature. He simultaneously respected and transgressed boundaries. He knew that boundaries are necessary to maintain order, but he also knew that sometimes they must be crossed. Robert Parker, scholar of Greek religion, writes, "The Hermes symbolized that Hermes was simultaneously the maintainer of order and the agent of chaos. This duality was reflected in the entire approach of ancient Greek society to rules and their transgression." His role in sexuality is also an interesting aspect of Hermes's figure. It was he who later united with Aphrodite, and from this union was born Hermaphroditus, who bore the characteristics of both sexes. This myth symbolically expresses that Hermes also transcended gender boundaries. He was the god who could bridge all dualities, who showed that apparently opposite things are actually connected to each other. Wendy Doniger, scholar of mythology and religion, writes, "Hermaphroditus, born from the union of Hermes and Aphrodite, expresses the profound truth that the masculine and feminine principles are not opposites, but complements." Hermes always embodied this balance. During the Renaissance, Hermes rediscovered his central role. Neoplatonic philosophers, particularly Marsilio Ficino, rediscovered the Hermetic writings, and these texts had an enormous influence on the thinking of the era. Ficino believed that the Hermetic teachings contained ancient wisdom, even more ancient than Moses and Plato. This view laid the foundation for the idea that there exists an ancient, universal wisdom that is found in all religions and philosophical systems. Giordano Bruno, who later died at the stake for his heresy, went even further. He taught that Hermetic wisdom was actually superior to Christian teaching because it derived directly from the divine source. Francis Yates observes, "For Bruno, Hermes Trismegistus was the true prophet, who saw divine truth more clearly than anyone else. This view naturally made Bruno dangerous in the eyes of the Church, but showed that Hermes's figure was still capable of inspiring and disturbing thinkers." In modern psychology, Hermes's archetype appears as a special aspect of the shadow self. James Hillman, Jungian psychologist who founded archetypal psychology, particularly occupied himself with Hermes's figure. According to Hillman, each of us has an inner Hermes who is cunning, who sometimes lies, who circumvents rules. This inner Hermes is not bad, but is a necessary part of our wholeness. If we repress this part, we become rigid, boring, and we lose our creativity. James Hillman writes, "Hermes is that part in us that is playful, tricky, sometimes morally questionable, but it is that part that allows us to adapt to changing circumstances, to be creative, to find solutions to problems for which there is no obvious answer." In contemporary times, Hermes's energy is perhaps more important than ever. We live in a world where boundaries are continuously changing, where communication plays a central role, where the boundary between truth and falsehood is increasingly blurred. Hermes teaches us to navigate in this complex, ambiguous world. He teaches us not to be naive, to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate us. But at the same time, he also teaches us not to be too rigid, to be creative, and sometimes to take risks. One of the deepest aspects of Hermetic teaching is that truth is not always clear. Sometimes the truth is admitting that we do not know the truth. Sometimes the truth is recognizing that every perspective is partial. Every statement depends on context. This does not mean relativism, but wisdom. Hermes teaches us to be cautious with absolute assertions, to be open to alternative perspectives, and to understand that reality is always more complex than we think. David Miller, scholar of mythology and religion, observes, Hermes's teaching is particularly relevant in the postmodern age, when we have recognized that there is no single grand narrative that would explain everything. Hermes always knew this, and that is why he could move freely between different worlds. Hermes's story ultimately speaks about how to live an authentic life in a world full of contradictions. Hermes showed that we do not have to choose between pure good and pure evil. We can be complex, contradictory, and yet whole. Integrity in Hermes's case did not mean that he always told the truth, but that he remained faithful to his own nature. He always remained Hermes, the boundary crosser, the intermediary, the trickster. And it was precisely this consistency that made him trustworthy, even when he lied. From the perspective of spiritual development, Hermes teaches us to accept our own shadow. Within each of us is the inner liar, the inner thief, the inner trickster. If we repress these parts, we will not be whole people. But if we succeed in integrating them, we gain enormous strength and creativity. Lewis Hyde, who studied trickster figures in different cultures, writes, "The trickster's teaching is that chaos is not our enemy, but the source of creativity." Hermes showed that sometimes we must step out of the comfort zone, cross boundaries, question rules in order to be truly alive. Hermes's presence in our lives can manifest in many ways. When we find ourselves in a situation where the traditional approach does not work, and we must find a creative solution. When we must cross boundaries that we have imposed on ourselves. When we face ambiguity and must learn to live with uncertainty. In the context of reincarnation, we can think of Hermes as the archetype of a soul that has passed through many lives and learned to navigate between worlds. His ability to cross boundaries between life and death, between conscious and unconscious, between truth and falsehood, can represent wisdom acquired through many incarnations. Some spiritual teachers claim that Hermetic energy is particularly active in the current age of transitions and transformations. We live in a period when old structures are crumbling and new ones have not yet emerged. In such a time, we need Hermes's ability to move in the in-between spaces, in ambiguities, in transitions. Hermes's gift to all of us is the ability to see things from different perspectives, to recognize that what seems to be truth from one point of view can be falsehood from another. This relative perspective is not a weakness, but a strength that allows us to understand the complexity of existence. In meditative practices, we can work with Hermes's energy as a guide for our inner journeys. When we meditate and travel deep into our unconscious, we need a guide who knows the paths between worlds. Hermes can be this guide, that part of our psyche that leads us safely across dangerous boundaries. Walter Burkert, expert on Greek religion, writes, Hermes was always the god of transitions, the god of those moments when we leave one thing and have not yet reached another. In these moments of uncertainty and vulnerability, his presence is most important. In the alchemy of the soul, of which Jung spoke, Hermes Mercury is that element which enables transformation. It is that fluid, changeable substance that dissolves old forms and allows new ones to emerge. Without this hermetic quality, transformation would not be possible. We would remain trapped in fixed, unchanging states. When we reflect on Hermes' story in the context of our own lives, we can ask ourselves, Where in my life do I need more Hermetic energy? Where am I too rigid, too attached to rules, too fearful of uncertainty? Where could I benefit from more flexibility, creativity, willingness to take risks? At the same time, we must ask ourselves, where am I perhaps using Hermetic energy destructively? Where am I lying to myself or others? Where am I avoiding responsibility by continuously changing positions? Where would more stability and truthfulness benefit me? The final lesson of Hermes is that life is a delicate balance. We need both stability and flexibility, both truth and the ability to see beyond the apparent. Hermes teaches us that we do not need to be perfect, but authentic. We do not need to always be honest, but always faithful to our essential nature. In the Kabbalistic tradition, Hermes Thoth represented knowledge that crosses boundaries between worlds. He was the guardian of secrets that could be revealed only to those who were ready to understand them. This idea of graduated knowledge, of truth that reveals itself in layers, is profoundly Hermetic. Yehuda Berg, Kabbalistic teacher, writes, "True Hermetic wisdom is not that which can simply be told, but that which must be lived and experienced." Hermes teaches us that certain truths can be understood only by crossing the boundaries that separate us from them. Hermes's figure also reminds us that deception and wisdom are not always opposites. Sometimes the greatest wisdom lies in knowing how to use deception when necessary. Sometimes the deepest truth hides behind a veil of falsehood. Hermes understood this paradox better than anyone. In the modern world, where we are constantly bombarded with information, where propaganda and manipulation are everywhere, Hermes's energy is more necessary than ever. We must learn to discern, to see beyond appearances, to recognize when someone is trying to deceive us. But we must also learn that not everything is black or white, that truth is often complex and nuanced. The spiritual practice that Hermes offers us is that of discernment without judgment. We can recognize deception without condemning those who practice it. We can see the complexity of the situation without losing our center. We can navigate between worlds without getting lost in them. But why was everyone afraid of Hermes? Perhaps because he represented something that challenges our most fundamental need for certainty and security. Hermes showed that nothing is fixed, that every truth can be a lie depending on perspective, that every boundary can be crossed. This is terrifying for those who seek absolute certainty. The fear of Hermes was the fear of ambiguity itself. In a world that desperately wants clear answers, Hermes offered only questions. In a society that craved moral absolutes, Hermes demonstrated that morality is contextual. In a culture that valued honesty above all, Hermes proved that sometimes lies serve a greater truth. People feared Hermes because he could not be controlled or predicted. You never knew whether the message he brought was true or false, whether he was helping or hindering, whether he was your ally or your adversary. This unpredictability made him dangerous in the eyes of those who sought order and stability. Yet this very quality also made Hermes essential. Without him, the gods could not communicate with mortals. Without him, souls could not find their way to the afterlife. Without him, merchants could not conduct trade. Without him, creativity and innovation would stagnate. The fear of Hermes was also a recognition of his indispensability. In our own lives, we often fear the Hermetic energy within us. We fear our own capacity for deception, our own ability to manipulate, our own trickster nature. We try to suppress this aspect of ourselves, to present only the honest, straightforward, respectable side. But in doing so, we lose access to enormous creative and adaptive power. The challenge Hermes presents us is not to become liars and thieves, but to integrate the trickster energy in a conscious and ethical way. To recognize that sometimes boundaries need to be crossed, that sometimes rules need to be bent, that sometimes the conventional approach will not work, and we need to be clever, adaptable, and yes, even a bit deceptive. Thank you for following this journey into the world of Hermes. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share it with others who are interested in spiritual wisdom. Write in the comments what surprised you most about Hermes' figure and which other ancient god or spiritual teaching you would like to hear about. In the upcoming videos, we will continue this journey into the mysteries of ancient wisdom, unveiling those truths that help us understand ourselves and the world in which we live. Hermes' teaching lives in us every time we cross a boundary, when we are creative, when we recognize that truth is always more complex than we think,